Thanks for taking part in this brief Bible dive with Beautiful Savior Lutheran Church in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and with me, Pastor Nick. In this brief Bible dive, we're talking about Nehemiah. He played an important role in the history of the Jewish people. He has a book in the Bible that's named after him. And Nehemiah was one of those many Jewish exiles who grew up away from their homeland after the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, destroyed it, and carried the leading citizens in exile to Babylon. Eventually, the Persians defeated the Babylonians, and the Persians were much more tolerant of the Jewish people. Other names that pop up in the Bible during the time of the exile and of Nehemiah, and whose names are also have books of the Bible named after them, are Daniel, Esther, Ezra, for example. The Persians, being more tolerant than the Babylonians, allowed the Jewish people to begin returning to their homeland. This is how Nehemiah heard a report from his brother named Hanani, who traveled from Jerusalem. And Nehemiah asked Hanani how the Jewish people who had remained in Jerusalem in that area were faring, and Hanani gave him this incredibly disturbing report of how those living in Jerusalem were being mistreated, how the city walls and the gates were still destroyed, leaving the people defenseless to raiders, to enemies, and so on. So this broke Nehemiah's heart so much that he wept. He wept enough that the Persian king, King Artaxerxes, noticed that Nehemiah wasn't looking well. Which specific King Artaxerxes this was is still a little bit up for debate, but scholars tend to agree that it was probably Artaxerxes the First, who reigned from about 464 to 424 BC. And most people wouldn't have been, given the time of day by the Persian king, to be blunt. But Nehemiah was actually his cupbearer, which is a position of incredible trust, and which also put him in the orbit of the king. A person was not allowed to address the Persian king without first being addressed by the king. This was so strict that it was actually punishable by death to talk to the king without permission. Even in the book of Esther, when Esther approaches her husband, who's the Persian king, and to address him, he accepts it because he loves her so much. But there's a bit of tension reading that story because it actually was punishable by death for even his wife to address him without being, first approached. So Nehemiah was asked by the king, was asked during one of the king's many banquets at his winter palace in Susa. He was asked, how are you doing? What's going on? And Nehemiah shared how sad he was about his people being in distress. But Nehemiah didn't just leave it there. Nehemiah had been praying fervently to God for the right moment to do something for his people. For Nehemiah's people, for God's people. And sure enough, the opportunity presented itself when the king addressed him. In Nehemiah chapter 2, we hear a recounting of the story of the king asking Nehemiah about his sadness, and then of Nehemiah telling him, and then praying more, and then boldly asking for the permission and the resources to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And the king granted this request. Nehemiah proceeded to travel to Jerusalem, now not as the cupbearer of the king, but as the new governor of Persian-controlled Jerusalem. Nehemiah proceeded to get to work immediately once he arrived and faced incredible opposition, local opposition to the project. This is actually the beginning of the conflicts between the Jewish people and the Samaritan people, conflicts that came really into full blossom by the time that Jesus walked the earth, and conflicts so vehement that Jesus did what he could through his teachings and his miracles and his other actions to diminish the racial tensions and the racist impulses that existed between the two people. So two people continue to pop up as chief nemesis, I guess you'd say, in this story, people that were so opposed to Nehemiah and his work. The first is Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite. They hated the Jewish people. They wanted them to suffer. They wanted them to fail at every turn. They threatened the lives of Nehemiah and his workers, but sure enough, Nehemiah succeeded in his endeavors. In fact, reconstruction of these walls was completed in just 52 days. The walls were only about half of the original height. The gates still needed to be completed. But finally, after many, many decades, the circle was finally there, encircling the city with this protected wall. Again, more work needed to be done, but finally there was some form of defense. And again, it was all built within 52 days. 52 days. I mean, can you imagine anything getting built that fast today, let alone city walls? But they did it. They did it because the people were focused on a common mission and because they knew that God was behind them. So throughout all of this time, Nehemiah, as the new governor, did everything he could to benefit the welfare of the people. He refused to levy taxes because it would burden the people who were already suffering. He refused the special rations from the king that he would have received as the governor because he didn't think that he should eat in luxury while others were still struggling to find food. He didn't acquire personal property, despite the fact that a city with new walls would have actually had a spike in property value after that completion. And he didn't because he was focused on getting the people their own housing and protection. After returning to Jerusalem from a face-to-face meeting with the Persian king, when he went out to visit the Persian king, Nehemiah actually discovered that the temple was being used inappropriately. And so he purified the temple and began a very strict enforcement of the Mosaic law, that is, the law that came from God through Moses. And while strict crackdowns, when you see them in history, they can sometimes lead to economic problems, economic challenges. There was actually increased prosperity and security as a result of Nehemiah's actions. And there was also a spiritual revival that flourished as well. So for all of this good, the end of the book of Nehemiah gives us another glimpse into Nehemiah's heart and how he was a person of courage for and faithfulness to God. The very last words of the very last verse of the book that bear Nehemiah's name, it's a simple but profound prayer to God. And simply, this is what Nehemiah wrote: "Remember me, O my God, for good. Remember me, O my God, for good." In other words, despite all that Nehemiah achieved, he knew he wasn't perfect, but he strived to be faithful to God and wanted God to remember the good that he had done. So that's Nehemiah. Thanks again for joining with me, Pastor Nick, and with Beautiful Savior in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. If you want to learn more about our church, we invite you to our website, bslcmi.org. And of course, we'd love for you to share this video with somebody you think would find it interesting. Maybe like the video and subscribe as well. Now, go love God and love your neighbors.